Hello, this is Ron Willauer with Lesson 5 on the Olivet Discourse, the things Jesus said from the Mount of Olives prior to his persecution, where he told his disciples what would happen in the future. And we are ready for Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 to 14, and the parallel passages in Mark and Luke, and I want to start off by reading those. Matthew 24:9, starting with, "Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." Then from Mark, "Be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations. When they arrest you and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. But you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. And you will be hated by all because of my name. Yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives." So you might want to read those a little slower and for yourself, but I'll get into commenting on those, and you can put those two together. Before we even get into it, just a summary of what these passages are talking about is the gospel being preached and spreading, but persecution happening at the same time. That's the basic theme of all those. And that fits with the idea that his disciples asked Jesus, "When will these things be?" I talked about that. He said that in Matthew 24. Well, what I talked about, he said it, but what I talked about was these things go back to Matthew chapter 23. His disciples came to him when he said, "There won't be one stone upon another," and said, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign of thy coming and the end of the age?" You know what? Rather than starting in Matthew 23, let's go to Matthew 24 and read that exactly. Matthew 24:3. "As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?'" So that was the question, and my point was these things was not just the destruction of the temple when Jerusalem was defeated. 24:2, he talked about one stone upon another would be thrown down, because that would be this thing. When will this thing happen? And I believe these things go back to Matthew 23, and so we will look at Matthew 23. Starting in verse 34, "Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So I believe this is Jesus when he's explaining when will these things be to the disciples. This is part of what he's explaining. Now here he is addressing the leaders of the Jews. So he's saying, therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes. But when we go back to the passage we were looking at, or the passages we just read from the three parallel accounts, he's addressing his disciples. So he's, instead of saying, I will send you scribes and wise men and such, he's telling them, his disciples, I'm going to send you to them, and they're going to persecute you. So I think he's talking about the same events from a different perspective. So my first point about this passage is that the events of these verses begin, maybe I think they extend past too, but begin before the events of Matthew 24, 4-8 in the parallel verses. So Luke 21, 12, just above us here, he says, but before all these things they will lay hands on you and persecute you, delivering you to synagogues, etc. And it'll lead for an opportunity for your testimony. All these things he had just spoken of were the wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, and famines. So this spread of the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, and the persecution for it began first. And an example here of how early it started was from Acts chapter 5, verses 40 to 41. They took his advice, and after calling the apostles, and they flogged them and ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus, and then released them. So they went on their way from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they had been considered worthy to suffer shame for his name. And it said here earlier that you would be brought before councils. Where was that? That says courts. I think it said, well, maybe it said courts, and I was thinking council, but I thought it said council. Anyhow, the point is just the persecution, the preaching of the gospel and the persecution really did start very soon. Back in Acts chapter 5, verse 40 was very soon after Jesus' ascension. Well, the point of this is that what Jesus said was not giving in chronological or time order. He talked about false Christs and not being misled by them. And then he talked about the period of preaching the gospel and persecution, and he said this will happen before all these things. Well, so the second thing that he talked about started first. So you have to be careful about looking at this in strict time order. It's not that way. Well, why would Jesus talk about the false Christs before the preaching of the gospel and the persecution? Well, I think it's because the main idea he wanted to get across to them was don't believe these false Christs. And that's the purpose, the main purpose of what he was trying to say. Well, he didn't just try to say it. It's Jesus. He said it. But the point he was getting across. The other point about the timing of it, this persecution was not of short duration. This can be seen from the statement that the gospel would be preached to all nations and they would be hated by all nations. And I give the scripture references from where we just read. It took some time for the gospel to be proclaimed to such an extent that it could be said all nations hated them. So this persecution continues for some time period. Now, how far that time period is, that's another question. I believe the preaching of the gospel and the persecution that he was talking about is continuing until today. But that is a point that could be, you could take a different side on. Jesus stated there would be false prophets in Matthew 24:11. There's that statement. We'll go back there. This is kind of interesting. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many. This is a quote from Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, or History of the Destruction of Jerusalem, about false prophets. Now there were a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants to impose on the people, who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God. And this was in order to keep them from deserting, and that they might be buoyed up above fear and care by such hopes. Now the tyrants, when you read this book that Josephus was talking about, were the military leaders that were rebelling against Rome. He called them tyrants. He was against them. He thought they were doing the wrong thing, so he called them tyrants. He didn't use the word false Christs. I think they could fit the terminology of false Christ, because they were saying, I'm going to lead this rebellion against Rome. We're going to defeat them. We're going to set up a kingdom, and we'll have a king in Israel again. That would be similar to Jesus, the son of David, as the king. So there were a great number of false prophets that the tyrants suborned. I should have looked that word up, but they convinced the false prophets to do their bidding, basically, to impose on the people that they should wait for deliverance from God to keep them from deserting. So what they were saying, the false prophets were saying, don't flee Jerusalem. Just the opposite of what Jesus is telling his disciples, flee Jerusalem. Don't flee, God's going to deliver you. God's going to rescue you. He's going to give you victory over the Romans. That's kind of the idea there. So that's what's going on at that time. It's not necessarily, as I pointed out earlier, false prophets occurring now in our time. There were false prophets back then. And the passage started off with, as I pointed out in the last lesson, Jesus said, you will hear, and the original language is, you are about to hear of wars and rumors of wars. And the fact that he said you will hear, those people there, and that they were about to, it was going to happen soon, indicated that he was talking about things right then, not 2,000 years later. And the false prophets, that would be the case too. Now, are there false prophets today? Sure, that's a whole other question. But there were false prophets then, and they ran into those things then. Josephus also wrote the following about love growing cold because of lawlessness. I also find this pretty interesting. That's from Matthew 24:12. We go back here. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. We go back to the quote from Josephus then. Okay. This is Josephus saying, or writing, to say all in a word, no other gentle passion was so entirely lost among them as mercy. For what were the greatest objects of pity did most of all irritate these wretches, and they transferred their rage from the living to those that had been slain, and from the dead to the living. Nay, the terror was so very great that he who survived called them that were first dead happy, as being at rest already, as did those that were under torture in the prisons declare that upon this comparison those that lay unburied were the happiest. These men therefore trampled upon all the laws of men and laughed at the laws of God. And for the oracles of the prophets, they ridiculed them as the tricks of jugglers. So Josephus here is mainly talking about, again, those who were the leaders of the rebellion, and they were in Jerusalem. I think this was, if I recall right, this was something that he was saying of the leaders while they were in Jerusalem and under siege by the Romans. But the point is that they laughed at the laws of God, that because lawlessness increased, the love of many would grow cold. And they're talking about them not having any mercy and torturing people in prisons and leaving dead people unburied. And that's not obviously showing a heart of love. So this is also something that actually happened during that time, not necessarily something that will happen in the future. Doesn't mean it won't, that could all be argued, but it did happen, that kind of thing happened at that time. Now, Jesus said that the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, there are a couple times that end is used in this passage. I think they're used in different ways. Okay, let's go back to these scriptures and actually read where he says that. The one who endures to the end will be saved. There's Matthew 24:13, Mark 13:13, and Luke 21:9. So Matthew 24:13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Well, that goes along with, and many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. So that really is more among believers. The passage that I quoted from Josephus was not among believers. It's those that did not flee and were in Jerusalem. But it's just showing in general that lawlessness had increased in that time. So many will fall away, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. Well, falling away would be denying the Christian faith because of the persecution or for whatever reason, but mostly the persecution. Mark 13. The one who endures to the end. Oh, the very last. The one who endures to the end, he will be saved. You will be hated by all because of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he'll be saved. Down here. And then in Luke, he says a little bit differently, by your endurance you will gain your lives. So this end that we're talking about here is talking about I need to scroll down a little bit more. It's talking about people not falling away from the faith, individuals not falling away, and you have to endure to the end to be saved. So it's not a group thing. So I believe this refers here merely to remaining faithful to Jesus throughout your life. It's not the destruction of Jerusalem, nor is it the bodily return of Jesus to earth. It seems clear to me because of the reference by Jesus of them being put to death before either of these events. He thinks that you're going to put some of you to death, but endure to the end and you'll be saved. Well, for those people, that was the end. That was an individual end. It wasn't any cosmic, universal event that was the end there. So then Luke 21, verse 8 to 19, I think it refers to the resurrection onto eternal life, not the destruction of Jerusalem. So let's go back and look at that. Luke 21, 18 to 19. It says, yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. Well, you could take that if the preterist view was, hey, you're not going to perish. You follow my instructions. You stick with me, and you'll gain your lives. You won't be killed when Jerusalem is destroyed. But in the context here, you will be betrayed by parents and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name, yet not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. Well, it seems contradictory that they'll put some of you to death, but you won't perish. Well, not a hair of your head will perish. You'll die, but your hair will be in place. I don't know why. But that's so contradictory. They're going to kill you, but you won't die. And by your endurance, you will gain your lives. So I think that's talking about the resurrection. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and life. He that believes in me, though he die, yet he will live. And he that lives and believes in me will never die. So they'll put you to death, but you won't perish because you'll come back to life later. I think that's how the contradiction here is resolved, and that's what he was talking about. He's not talking about being rescued from dying, because some of them you'll put to death. So going back here to, okay, the end of Matthew 24:14, however, does not appear to be the same individual end to which believers must endure, but a more universal end. So I'm going to scroll back up to the end of Matthew 24:14. It says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." Well, that doesn't seem like an individual. And that's something bigger, more people involved, something more to it than that. The preterist view on that is the end is the destruction of Jerusalem. The gospel will be preached, and then Jerusalem will be destroyed, in the temple, of course, along with it. My view is that I put out earlier is that the end that Jesus has been talking about was the end of the nation of Israel, not having the literal earthly king and having the kingdom. And so that would occur when Jesus bodily returns to earth, and that would be the end that was spoken of there. So that verse said that the end would occur after the gospel of the kingdom is proclaimed to all nations. And there are Bible verses that indicate the gospel was widely proclaimed prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. Colossians 1:23, "If indeed you continue in the faith firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister." So here Paul is saying that the gospel was proclaimed in all creation under heaven. So it was very extensively proclaimed and spread. Now, of course, he's not saying that every single individual living on the earth at that time heard the gospel. So there's a degree of how much the gospel had spread. And you have to keep that in mind, that that didn't happen. The gospel went out to great extent, but not everybody in the whole physical earth heard the gospel. When he says it was proclaimed in all creation, that's not quite as extensive as to everyone in creation, or to all people groups in creation, or that type of thing. On the day of Pentecost, when all the people came for Pentecost and Peter preached, and there were thousands of people that got saved, and they were from all these different nations, and they went back to them, and these people shared the gospel with them, and it was proclaimed in all creation. So in that extent, the gospel has been, who it's been shared with, has been spreading and spreading and spreading. And at any point in time, you could say, "Oh, the gospel was preached in all creation." Where do you draw the line? Okay, now is when it's all everybody's heard. Well, it's really a matter of degree of it's being more and more proclaimed throughout time. But anyhow, here's another verse about it being greatly preached, greatly spread, and all before the destruction of Jerusalem, because these were written before then. Colossians 1:5-6, "Because of the hope laid up for you in heaven, of which you previously heard in the word of truth, the gospel which has come to you, just as in all the world also it is constantly bearing fruit and increasing, even as it has been doing in you also since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God in truth." So it's bearing fruit and increasing in all the world. So again, that's a matter of extent. Right from the beginning, it was bearing fruit and increasing. Romans 1:8, first I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. So their faith also is being spread throughout the world. That great extent that it did actually happen in the time before Jerusalem was destroyed. To great extent, the gospel spread. So in Romans 10:17-18, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. But I say, surely they have never heard, have they? Indeed they have. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. So what I say here, certainly the gospel had gone out quite extensively prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, as these verses clearly demonstrate, since they are generally believed to have been written before 70 AD. The gospel had gone throughout the Roman Empire, and according to church tradition, the Apostle Thomas took the gospel to India. But Matthew 24:14 speaks of the gospel going to all nations. None of these verses, other verses that I just read, says it goes to all nations. The Greek word for nations is ethnos, which means, from which we get the word ethnic or ethnicities. Therefore means people groups more than governmental entities, so ethnic groups. Jesus was saying that the gospel would go to every ethnic group before the end would come. The same Greek word is translated nation in the following verse, Revelation 5:9. And they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. So this is speaking of the gospel going to where all ethnic groups. There'd be people from all ethnic groups that would hear and believe and be singing a song. The word tongue above refers to language. So all people from all languages, every language, there'd be some people that would hear the gospel and believe. So this is more, to me, this is more extensive language. The gospel had to go to every people of every language, people of every ethnic group. I don't think the language in these other verses, not in the Olivet Discourse, meet that same requirement. They don't say it will go to every nation and every language. It's talking about extensive preaching of the gospel, but it's not this extensive. Well, that's basically what I said in the first couple sentences here. There was in this third sentence, there was a great spread of the gospel throughout the world, especially the Roman Empire, but not to every people group and language. The inhabitants of North and South America, Australia, Southern Africa, etc., had not yet heard. So Jesus' statement that the gospel would go to all nations was not yet fulfilled in 70 AD. So this passage, or set of parallel passages that talk about the gospel going forth, and people being persecuted, and the gospel will go to all nations, and then the end will come. But something that I believe is continuing on. That's still all happening. The gospel still being preached. There's still persecution. There's still being people put to death. There's still people that fall away. There's still false prophets, although I think those things are primarily referring, those in particular, the false prophets and people falling away, that happened in great extent before the fall of Jerusalem. But the whole context is things are still going on, still happening. So I think this is talking about things that are happening from when Jesus ascended to when he returns, for that whole period. I don't think there's anything that is saying at this point in time that stops. When Jerusalem was destroyed, did the preaching of the gospel and the persecution and these things stop? No, they continue on. So I think this passage is referring to long term, when earlier I said that it had to be fairly long term because it had to be heeded by all nations. It wasn't just a short thing. I think it's a very long term thing that this continues throughout the whole Christian age, if you want to call it that, whatever is the correct term. So that is the end of that lesson. I went through that very fast there at the end, didn't I? Couldn't read it that fast. But that's the end of that lesson, and I hope that was helpful and challenging and encouraging and instructive and all those things. And by the way, at the bottom of the screen here, I have my email. If you care to contact me, that's probably the best way to do it. If you want to communicate about this, if you think I'm incorrect and want to correct me, that's great, because I've been corrected before and I need corrected when I'm wrong. So contact me if you'd like to do that. And that's the end of our lesson, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.